Welcome to all of you. Uh, just begin by saying I've been at Northwestern. I was at Northwestern for more than 20 years, and I think I'll stand. I feel better. So many years as a professor, you always stand. For more than 20 years, but 16 of those years I was the senior associate dean at the School of Journalism, and in 2008, the university asked me to go to Qatar because they were planning to open a campus there, and would I go and help figure out how to run a journalism program in a country where there's no free speech. And so I thought, well, this was a challenge I'd like to try. We did, and my wife Trish, who's here tonight, and I went there, and again, from March till August, we've selected a bunch of students, and we started teaching in August, and it's come a long way since then. And so has Qatar. Now, I haven't been back there in almost 5 years, which puts me at a bit of a disadvantage tonight in listening to this lecture and asking questions about this lecture about architecture, because in 5 years, so much has already changed. In fact, we used to say if we went out of town for a weekend and came back to Doha, there'd be a new building. There would be something new all the time. It has moved so very fast in the last, 15 years probably. Things that were empty land are now massive, important facilities. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And to do that talking is our guest speaker, who I'll now sit down and talk to him. Phillip Jodidio is not an architect, but an architect critic. He knows a heck of a lot about it. He's written now 4 books about architecture in Qatar, and has written or edited more than 100 books on this subject. He was, for many years, I think 20, editor of an architectural magazine in Paris. He was born in the United States. He's grown up and lived in Europe most of his life, still lives now in Switzerland. And he's the expert on this stuff, especially about what's going on in Doha. And so, Philip, if you would, we appreciate hearing all the stuff you have to say.
Thank you very much, Richard. I've been asked to go rather quickly, and I was told beforehand that you might not know too much about what has happened recently in Qatar. Obviously, that is not the case of some of the people here. That's clear. But I'm going to take a kind of an overview of things that have been happening relatively recently in contemporary architecture in Qatar, because I think it is indicative of the nature of the nation, of what is happening there. It is a symbol. I was asked for the opening of the National Museum of Qatar to moderate a panel at the National Library by Her Excellency Sheikha Al-Mayasa about the subject architecture as a face of a nation. And I think that I'm sorry, I've already gone forward. The point that I would like to make is that here you're going to see works by very famous architects, which are intended essentially for the public. These are not works that are related often to business. They are more related to education, culture, and the state, and bringing the state of Qatar and its people very much into the forefront of what is happening in the 21st century world. Here, just a general view, which I took from the park of the Museum of Islamic Art. You see in the background a tower that I'll refer to afterwards, designed by Nouvel, who just finished work on the National Museum of Qatar. But in the foreground here, there's a sculpture by the American artist Richard Serra, which is on a kind of boat-like promontory, this is just opposite the Museum of Islamic Art. It's been compared in a contemporary way, you may not agree, but to the Victory of Samothrace, which is on also a kind of the prow of a boat in the Louvre, for those of you who've been to the Louvre. And it is symbolic in a way of a gesture and a power that is expressed in the art and the architecture that we're going to see. This just to give you a basic idea for those of you who have not been there of the Arabo-Persian Gulf. We often call it the Persian Gulf, but there that's not a good thing to do. And so we have here Doha on the peninsula, and then a closer in map of Doha showing the area where the this is the new international airport. This is the area where IMP built the Museum of Islamic Art. And here we have the National Museum of Qatar. And this is the West Bay area, which you'll see in a moment has developed greatly. Now here, a relatively recent helicopter view. So in the foreground here, you have the National Museum of Qatar, which opened in March and is dedicated to the history and culture of the country. Designed by Nouvel, with a large park area around it, and some other features that I'll be able to show you in another image. And as you can see, it's very close to the Museum of Islamic Art, designed by IMP and opened in 2008. That's here. So this is the West Bay area, with again this tower by Jean Nouvel visible here. One of the points I wanted to make is that the effort to build in Qatar has been going on for some time, and with very prestigious international architects. This is the Ministry of Finance, which is actually almost opposite the Museum of Islamic Art on the other side of the Corniche. And the part that you see here was designed by Kenzo Tange, a very famous Japanese architect who designed the National Gymnasium for the 1964 Japanese Olympics, and a significant figure in contemporary architecture. He actually added on to a building that existed there. So it's this platform. And Tange had an influence and was actually meant to build a lot more on this area of the near the Corniche. There was originally supposed to be a courthouse, a National Assembly building, as well as other structures. Those were never built. So here, this is a view, if you want, almost across from the building that we just saw, of West Bay at night, with the Sheridan Hotel that was finished in the 1980s, one of the other early buildings by a well-known international architect in Doha, and then Nouvel's tower, which can be lit in various colors. There are other towers here, the Tornado Tower and others that have been noted for their architectural quality. But as you can see, it's a rapidly growing place. This is a closer-in view of Jean Nouvel's tower, which was originally designed for Sheikh Saud Al Thani, who was a minister of culture at a certain time, and who is one of the figures who started the effort in Qatar to build a series of museums. Sheikh Saud was important in the development of the early idea of the Museum of Islamic Art that was later finished by IMP. This is show you that it can be in orange as well as other colors. Now this is the Museum of Islamic Art. I think the first significant cultural edifice designed here in 2008 by I.M. Pei, the architect of the pyramid, and of course he just passed away, as you may have heard, at the age of 102. And Mr. Pei was looking here for what he called the essence of Islamic architecture. It wasn't necessarily the essence of a form to be found in Qatar. In fact, he looked to Cairo and the Al-Azhar Mosque and was inspired for this section of the building by the central fountain in Al-Azhar Mosque. This is a closer view of the entrance lined by palm trees, the fountains. An interior view where the architect sought to use geometric pattern because he saw the evidence of geometric pattern in Islamic architecture and civilization. Now, the interiors of the building were done by a French designer and architect called Jean-Michel Villemotte, and very beautifully done. I think this is one of the most advanced and probably expensive museums to have been created in recent years. Again, 2008, and a collection which consists essentially in works that do not come from Qatar, but come from all over the Muslim world. This is a view of the of Mushreb downtown Doha. This is a part that was completed in 2012. This is a building which is behind the Emiri Diwan, for those of you who know the area. It's actually a series of buildings which have been designed to the highest ecological and technological standards. There are a number of architects who've worked on this complex, including David Adjaye, the English architect. And it is indicative of a desire not only to build modern buildings that are, but buildings that are ecologically and technologically up to date. Here again, the museum, which opened on March the 27th, you can see that this very large complex, designed by Jean Nouvel, who inspired himself with the form of the desert rose. It's a stone formation that you can find under the sand sometimes in Qatar, but also in other desert locations. Of course, this is a much larger version. The desert rose is often quite small. And here, very significantly, the building wraps around what was the old palace of Doha before the construction of the Emiri Diwan. This is a building, group of buildings that dates from the beginning of the 20th century. And essentially, there was very little here until well after the discovery of oil in 1940, and also the confirmation of the very large reserves of gas, of natural gas, which was only, the confirmation of the quantities was only in the early 1970s. So much of what you see here, and all of this back here, is very recent. Except for this palace, which was restored for the occasion of the opening of the museum. Here's an aerial view of the National Museum of Qatar, which is, again, as you recall from earlier, basically across the Corniche Road from the Museum of Islamic Art. And here you have the old palace restored. There are no displays in the old palace. There are spaces that have been the spaces themselves and the walls have been restored and the woodwork, but there are no objects inside. So people visit the museum here and then come into this area. And there's a large central square. Here is another aerial view of the same museum where you see the old palace inserted into the central square, which the architect called a caravanserai. And this is where events are held. For example, the official inauguration of the museum with the presence of His Highness the Emir was in this space. Again, I've included a number of views of this building because I think it's significant in terms of the development of architecture and culture in Qatar. The architect here created a lagoon, a space which represents the original outline of the shore, which was afterwards moved out with landfill in the 1970s and 1980s to accommodate the Corniche Road, which goes all the way around the bay to West Bay. Here again is the Museum of Islamic Art. Inside the caravanserai space of the museum, and which is surrounded by gardens, which are of course planted with local species and with a respect for the environment. This is a view inside the museum where there are very large scale, there are models, there are films that were made for the walls here, very large curving walls. So this is an unusual effort to tell the history of Qatar from it goes from geology, in other words, the desert rose that is the origin of this building, to the natural life, the sea life, and also the life of the people, of course. Now here, this is another area of great development in in Qatar. And Dean Roth was talking earlier about Northwestern University, but there are also a number of other American universities, in particular Carnegie Mellon, Georgetown, Weill Cornell, that operate here. Now, in this image, you can see the headquarters of the Qatar Foundation, which was designed by Rem Koolhaas, very well-known Dutch architect. Here is the National Library of Qatar, which opened just about a year ago. Very modern and very open facility. But Education City is not limited to universities. It also includes, for example, a world-class medical center. This is the Sidra Hospital, designed by another more or less American architect, Cesar Pelli. And you see a bit of the National Convention Center here, which is a work of Arata Isozaki, Japanese architect. Another aerial view, this is the new mosque. This is the National Library seen from the other side. Here is the Qatar Foundation headquarters, and here the National Convention Center. And the layout of Education City, the master plan was made by Arata Isozaki, who was an employee of Kenzo Tange, whose building I showed you earlier. And Isozaki built this building and also imagined a green spine that goes in this direction from the National Convention Center to the ceremonial court, which we'll see in a moment. There are a number of other architects who participated in the work at Education City. This is a Mexican architect who's passed away called Legoretta. It's Texas A&M. And this is an interior where this man from Mexico who was influenced by Barragan, if you know a bit about Mexican contemporary or modern architecture. So there are these very bright colors. The intention was not necessarily to be Qatari in some way, but to fit into the environment, to fit into the way of life that is emerging through this new emphasis on education. This is inside the National Convention Center, and I showed it because this is a large work of Louise Bourgeois, French-American sculptress who has passed away. She calls this Maman, mother, which is kind of funny psychologically, but it is nonetheless an indication of the openness and the desire to be in the spirit of contemporary art and architecture. This, I think, you can almost certainly say that if this object is in the National Convention Center, it's because it's the will of Her Excellency Sheikh Al-Mayasa. This is the front of the National Convention Center, as you see it from the main road that cuts Education City in two. Again, Arata Isozaki, Japanese architect. Now, just opposite that facade, there is a long green spine which ends up here, the ceremonial court, which was designed for commencement proceedings of the various universities present at Education City. Again, very striking and open architecture. I think one interesting thing I didn't mention about the National Library, the National Museum, all of these buildings are open to the public, including the education buildings at Education City. You can just walk in out of your car. It's better than to walk there. But you can walk into the National Library without showing any paper, without buying a ticket. These are open places, and that, I think, is very significant. This is the National Library, seen from the side of that main road that goes by. And the entrance, I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. The entrance is in this area that lifts up off the ground. A closer view with the entrance. This is inside the National Library. It's one gigantic space, and the architect conceived an area that is below ground here for archives, this whole section here in a sand-colored stone. And up here you have stacks. There are not books in them in this photo yet, but they're all filled with books. And this is an open place where you can go and you can look at books, you can meet people. There are cafes. It's at once modern and attractive. This is the headquarters of the Qatar Foundation, which is not really open to the public. That's one building. The Qatar Foundation has been presided over by Her Highness Sheikha Moza, who is the wife of the father emir, the former emir of Qatar, and the mother of Sheikh Mayasa. Now, this is, it represents, if you want, the next phase in the development of the architecture of Qatar. I think this is the first stadium to be completed for the 2022 World Cup. It's the Arhuaco Stadium, and it was designed originally by Zaha Hadid, who has since passed away, and but her team continues to work. And this very striking building. This is a view of the roof, as you can see here. Very modern and striking building. And here, the inside of the stadium, which will be one of the major venues for the 2022 Football World Cup. There's another very large stadium under construction at Lusail, which will be the venue for the opening and closing, the final of the World Cup, and that was designed by Norman Foster from England. So you see that I referred to the conference that I was asked to participate in Doha for the opening of the National Museum. And the theme was architecture as a face of a nation. Here I feel, even in this very brief overview, you can tell that there has been an effort to call on some of the best architects in the world, and also to do it in a way which is progressive and forward-looking and open. The education that is being offered to the people of Qatar, but also others who come from elsewhere in the region and from other countries in the world, is at the highest level. There is a desire for openness, there is a desire for quality, there's a desire for modernity. And I must say that some of it may sound a little strange to people who listen to the news and hear sometimes negative things about countries like Qatar. But I can tell you, for having been there, I've been there I think 18 times, and I've been to all the buildings that I've shown you. I can tell you that it's a place that is open, that is forward-looking, and that is preparing its own people for a future which may be a future without carbon fuels, without oil, without gas. Although it's said that the gas of Qatar will last 150 years at the present rate of consumption or of use of it. I think that this is one of the places in the world where contemporary architecture has been used not to express politics, but to express what is inside the country, what the country will be in the future. It's a small country, but you can see the number of buildings and the number of efforts that have been made to show that Qatar is a progressive, forward-looking country. I really believe that. I believe that the Al Thani family that has ruled since the time of that old palace that I showed you earlier has led this change. Most of what I've shown you is related to one family, the ruling family. But that is not to be seen as a way of closing things. Rather, it is proven to be a way of opening to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. We're going to take some time to ask him questions. I'll ask one or two, and then any of you are welcome to ask questions. Before you begin asking, though, make sure you have a microphone in your hand. There are a couple of people who will bring a microphone to you at when you raise your hand, and they'll put a microphone in it. So, Philip, there are so many things about this place. Can you tell me something about you showed several pictures of the Qatar Foundation headquarters building.
Yes.
And it has that very interesting look, like the top 5 floors or something are floating. There's that big space. What's
There are offices for the Qatar Foundation, and I believe, although I have not been there, that there's an office for the chairperson of the foundation at the top.
Sheikh Moses has
Yes.
an office in there.
Yes, and it is a lovely place inside, really a wonderful, calm atmosphere. And the work, again, of Rem Koolhaas, who is one of the top architects in the world now, I would say.
There's another building that you didn't show that interests me, will interest people from Chicago, I think. And that's the Tornado Tower.
Yeah.
And folks in Chicago know about the Sears Tower and that glass viewing thing that hangs off the side of the building, which cracked a week or so ago. The Tornado Tower has a cantilevered swimming pool, I don't know how many stories up, that hangs out. That's, if you're in this hotel, you think, when am I going to get into this pool if it's hanging out so far? Can you tell me anything about the architecture of that tower? And
I've been in it, and I quite honestly did not see a swimming pool, but it is one of the buildings which is cited in West Bay as being of architectural interest. It has a curving form, like a tornado. It has a spiral form, which is, in terms of engineering, not extremely easy to realize, I think. And each of these buildings, though, is having to make its own space as others get built next to the field.
Did I say Tornado Tower? I meant Aspire Tower.
Oh, Aspire is another matter.
It has
Aspire.
It has
You
the
see,
pool hanging off
you
the
did
side.
say tornado, and I
I'm
was going to
sorry.
say I didn't see the pool, but Aspire Tower is the sports area. There's a stadium there,
Right.
which is not too far. You can actually see it if you're at a certain altitude from Education City. That was built, if I
For the Arab Games in 2006.
Yeah, and about the pool, I can't tell you. I know there's a hotel.
Okay. Let me ask you generally. You showed a picture of the convention center, for instance, and reminded me that, and you talked about the desert rose, but the convention center looks like it's being held up by the sidra tree.
Yeah.
The only thing that'll grow in the deserts. Are there many of those traditional, almost distinctly Qatari things that are represented in much of the architecture?
Well, I think there are examples, and the Sidra is, although Isozaki designed a similar building for the Florence railway station, so I can't tell you he didn't adopt the idea of the Sidra to this circumstance more in terms of the discourse than the reality. But the Sidra tree is as you know, the symbol of the Qatar Foundation. And so it's an apt symbol for this particular building. There are other buildings which are certainly closely related to the history of the country. There are a number of restored buildings, like the palace that I showed. And also there are markets that have been rebuilt, and some old buildings. The fact is that there are not many buildings beyond the beginning of the 20th century that still stand. So restoring them means rebuilding them entirely on the basis of what was left in the foundations, perhaps.
As was Souq Waqf rebuilt.
Yes.
Yeah, for those of you who haven't been there and don't know a whole lot about the place, some of the things referred to are, they're simply new, modern. This city has the newest, probably the best subway system, metro system in the world. And it's just opening. It's going to be wholly finished by the time of the 2022 World Cup, which will be held in November, December of 2022.
In the winter.
In wintertime. Yeah, it's always in the summer in the rest of the world. It's going to be winter there. And the final game will be, interestingly, on December 18th, which is National Day in Qatar. And a day of great celebration and great parades every year. I can imagine what it'll be like that year with millions of extra people in the country. But it's always the most festive day of the year there. And he mentioned Lusail City, where this final game and the stadium is built.
The iconic stadium.
The iconic stadium, it gets written about a lot, but this is a whole new city. That was totally desert when I got there, and is now this growing city on the bay.
I think there's some project like Mushrib that theoretically have developed on the basis of ideas of local architecture to some extent. I think there's a willful desire to build things that are modern in a truly international way. This is not, nobody was ever asked to do a reproduction of a Qatari building. There are some who have done that. There are a number of local architects of interest. One of the participants in the panel that I was involved in is Ibrahim Jaida, who speaks very well about how the young people who are, some of them at Education City now, are the ones who will form the country in the future. There are these examples that are coming from outside. The subways you cited, the stations are done by a Dutch architect, Ben van Berkel. But there's a unity to them, there's a modernity, they are at the highest level. So the young people are being given an example which is at a truly international level.
This area called Bushehr was the old downtown and falling apart, frankly, filled with lots of little shops. In one, somebody would sell parts for motors, and the next they would sell whatever. It's little shops by men who would come from Pakistan or wherever. And now I've read like 90% rebuilt in a new modern downtown area right behind the Emiri Diwan, which is where the Emir and the government have its offices. It's an important place in Doha. Let me ask you one final question, then everybody else. You're a friend of I.M. Pei's.
Yes.
What did he ended up? What was his final view of this? The importance of this museum that he built there, because it's such a striking place to me. And
yeah, again, I think he had the idea of building it practically on an island, which was constructed on West Bay. And because he was wary of the construction that was coming from behind, the towers and all, and he didn't want the museum to be amongst towers in the future. So he created a place where it is likely to remain on its own. He also was very attached to the idea of what he called the essence of Islamic architecture. He traveled all over looking for ideas for this museum, which is a museum of Islamic art, not a museum of Qatari art, but a museum of Islamic art. And as I say, he found his inspiration in Cairo. And I think that he insisted also on the play of light on the stone faces. He always used geometry. The way light brings the building to life. That is something which is intrinsically of this place, without necessarily being specifically Qatari. It's that sun, it's the desert, it's the water. That is also what Qatar is, I think.
okay, if anyone has questions, we have microphones. There's some hands.
Good evening. My question is actually about urbanism. I've had the good fortune to go to Doha half a dozen times, and my impression, and I'm an architect, certainly the country has asserted itself on the world stage, and the architecture is a part of that. And there's a desire to place oneself forward and be seen among one's peers. But what I've not seen is an attempt to knit things together in what might be called a more urbanistic way. The Al Zubarah archaeological dig in the northwest part of the country revealed a kind of urbanism that we think of as more traditional Islamic cities. But most of the buildings we're talking about here are object buildings. They're intended to sort of stand by themselves. And so my question, the Father Emir went through this period of establishing the country, and certainly Sheikh Tamim has extended that. Is it your sense that having established itself, certainly when the World Cup is over, that the nation will have an opportunity to assert more of that traditional side of its civilization in the form of urbanism? Because object buildings, it's yielded a car-based culture. And I'm wondering if the qualities of the souk and the ability to walk around are going to assert themselves as the country matures architecturally.
Well, I think the development of the city has gone beyond something which could be controlled from the outset. You could have set down rules. There were efforts to set down rules. There were a number of teams who tried in the 70s and even earlier, I believe, but in the 70s principally, to work out an urban pattern which applied to some extent to the area closer to the Emiri Diwan and less to West Bay. But as you've been there, you've seen that there is an almost chaotic development, which is the case of many modern cities. There has not been any kind of dictatorial effort to impose a specific pattern. I think things are coming together now to a greater extent, perhaps in part because of the World Cup, but with the subway connections, with public transport, which was certainly a missing element in Qatar. Don't let me
Okay.
keep you from...
Yes, sir.
Yes, and to some extent you asked my question, so I'm going to slightly pivot. I'm wondering if all of this also reflects sort of a master plan about some sort of a cultural policy, because usually architecture and cultural policy kind of dovetail with one another in terms of how you brand a nation globally. And there is a lot of commitment to building museums, and but are these reflective of some sort of a cultural policy, or is it just somebody who has a budget to do something and they just decide to do something?
No, it isn't. I mean, I'm sure you have things to say about that, but the point I was trying to make is with these buildings in particular, is that there is a commitment to openness. There is a commitment to modernity. There is a commitment to actually much more than we realize it outside of this part of the world, to equality between people, and the place of women. And I was talking to Dean Roth earlier, saying that since I've been going to Qatar, I've been working with women essentially, starting with Her Excellency and down from there, but essentially with women in the museums. And this is not exactly a response to your question, but I think there is a willful openness, a desire to teach, to learn, and to create an economy and a culture for the period that will come after the oil runs out. I think that's quite obvious. And it is not a person with a lot of money. It's not just the emir. The family, of course, is important. And the country, I think, is committed to openness, to modernity, and to things of beauty.
Yeah. On a very small piece of culture, I might tell you, I don't know what, maybe the requirements are not requirements, but every new building that I've been in, including the ones in Education City, but not just there, provide for the culture in terms of everyone has prayer rooms. They set aside space for prayer for 5 times a day for the Muslim prayer times. That you wouldn't find that set up in another area because they don't need it. But there, it's that important part of the culture is provided for.
I think also, if I just may, one point about the culture. I feel I'm a Christian. I'm not a Muslim, but I understand and feel that there is a certain tension between a strong Muslim culture and all of this modernity that's coming in from elsewhere. And I think that Qatar is one place that has found a certain balance, an interesting balance, between a respect for the religion of the place and also this openness, because I think the two are fundamentally not contradictory, contrary to what many people think.
I'll tell you something, a bit of funny. And in Education City, one of the most striking buildings there is the Faculty of Islamic Studies building. And it has on it this giant, yeah. And so the prayer is broadcast 5 times a day from this. Well, so this thing comes out, and we stopped. It was coming out right over the Northwestern building where we're teaching broadcast journalism. And they're on there with their microphones, and there's the prayer. So I said, we'll figure it out. So we figured it out. So we know what time the prayer is every day. It's published. And so we make sure we're not on the air at that time. So it works out. It works out fine. Yes, sir.
Thank on the point of modernity and Islam, I want to go back to the spider sculpture.
Oh, yeah.
Because when I saw it, some years ago, and I saw the name Mother, I was really challenged for a
Maman.
moment. And then I thought of the story of the spider protecting the prophet when he was running from those bad guys, the money changers in Mecca, up to Medina. And I thought, I have never had the privilege of asking Sheikh Moza or the artist, but it seemed to me it was a reference, and it was a very vital and vibrant meeting between the tradition and the context. So I just thought that really worked. And it is huge. I don't know if you get a sense of, it's got to be 20 feet high.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to say, and thank you very much, both of you, for the conversation, I think that for anyone who hasn't been, I urge you to go, take a look yourself, we were just there for a week and had a wonderful time. And I do believe that the new architecture really does start once you're inside Hamad Airport. And I know that was a big and a challenging project, and there are many stories about will it get done, et cetera. But there is no more beautiful airport in the world that I've seen. And so that's a great place to start. And I do, to my friend's point about urbanism, I think Musharraf may foretell more pedestrian-oriented, a sort of a contemporary reinterpretation with occasional squares, a little bit of chaos, high enough buildings for some shade, and context for folks to walk around. So I hope you all get to go, because it's well worth a visit.
The Louise Bourgeois sculpture is one of a series, and I would say it's almost certainly not inspired by Islamic ideas, but its placement here may well, as you say, have that in mind. You mentioned the project near the Emiri Diwan. It's also not far from the Souk Waqif, which was a sort of reconstituted area which was carried out by the private engineering office of the Emir, and which in a context of what is apparently regional or traditional architecture offers spaces where people can walk around and enjoy themselves, and at night it's just jammed with people.
On here.
Thank you. One thing I just wanted to say about Mama, there's a version of that in Ottawa that at the National Museum, I think a literal interpretation, that like sack under is the eggs are in the museum. That's the Mama of the eggs. But anyway, my question is about residential architecture. Are some of these principles of modernity, are you seeing in residential buildings, and is there a typical form of residential architecture in Qatar?
There have been some efforts to restore older areas, but in the new architecture, I said intentionally that the buildings that I've shown here are essentially projects that have to do with the ruling family, in culture, in sports, in other sectors. But residential architecture, as far as I know, has not been the object of very interesting developments. I may be wrong about that. Hasn't been a focus of what I worked on.
I absolutely agree with you that the buildings appear totally modern and are totally modern. And yet, having lived there for 6 years, I also know that there are suggestions of the landscape, of the traditions, of old Arab architecture in the buildings. And for example, behind the spider here, you see the open, it almost looks like a screen there. You often see that on the buildings in one form or another. The geometry in Islam, you do not create representations of people. So the art is geometric or suggestive of plants, wildlife, and that is very much present in all of the buildings that you've talked about, including the new Museum of Qatar with the sand sculpture.
Well, I think Jean Nouvel, because of the nature of the National Museum, he went back before history, as it were, which is also part of the context of what is shown there. The desert rose is related to a desert environment, as its name implies, but it is not specifically cultural. It is of this place. It is deeply of this place. And I think it's very true what you say, that there are many architects involved, and we didn't have time to talk about it, but there are frequent efforts to tie the contemporary architecture into the local context, to seek the geometric patterns. I mentioned Pei in passing, who did that. There are certainly efforts that are made. I'm not sure those efforts are always very profound, which is why I wouldn't insist on them too much. Sometimes they're interesting, of course.
There are many. I'll get to him next. I just want to say that there are many in Education City, many of these, I don't know, objects of all sorts that, and when they decide to build a building, they have these competitions, and there are 3, 5 world famous architects who bid for each one of these and offer up, and there's a committee that picks the architect based on lots of things, including those parts of the culture that are captured in these school buildings. Sir.
Hi. I actually thought you were going to show us the zigzag building and the cube building, but those, I think, they're kind of old. Vis-a-vis these other buildings that you were showing today. But my question, we know that Dubai has one of the largest, longest towers in the world, and the Saudis are building another one in Jeddah.
It's the same architect.
Some architect. Is there any project that you know of in Qatar to kind of try to go higher than those two?
I think it's been suggested. There were plans. There was talk of very high tower in Doha, but it interfered to some extent in the air traffic. I think, especially with the old airport, but the newer one is a little bit further out of the context. I don't think. My sense of Qatar, I know I'm speaking in front of Qatari people, so I do so with modesty. But my sense of Qatar is that there is not this fabulous desire to be higher than the neighbor. There is a desire to be interested in the culture, in the history as well, of course, in creating a modern country. And building the tallest tower, I don't think, it doesn't really make that much sense. I know the Saudis and et cetera, but I don't see the sense of it in this place, honestly. That's my personal reaction.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, here's one. Thank you, Fatma.
This seek for modernity and openness, does that get extended to, is it just for the population there to bring them into a different era, or is it also to bring in Western civilization to feel more comfortable and visit and participate?
Well, I think the balance is a delicate one. There's certainly a desire to encourage tourism, and the tourism of the cultural sort certainly won't upset things. I'm not sure about the football, but then the people who come for the football won't remain very long. There's a desire for tourism. There's naturally a desire, I think, to also to make the future of the young people of this country. I think that's what is happening. It's an example. It's also a way of stating what the country is, what it does for its people. And this extends to other areas that we're not talking about, the social areas, but naturally education, not only at Education City, but in other parts of the system as well.
Okay. I think we have time for one or two more.
Yeah, my question is actually for the journalism professor. I think there is, my impression having been there, is that there is a misperception of, you talk about openness of Al Jazeera. My impression is that it was, every journalism outlet has its predispositions. My feeling was it was actually very open and very much a force for openness and conversation. What is, as a journalism professor, what's your impression of it, both in terms of perception and the reality, as far as it as a news outlet? Because I saw it really as a positive that in a lot of ways was misunderstood.
Well, I've always seen Al Jazeera as a positive. They've hired many of our students. And but one needs to see there's a difference. Al Jazeera is two things. There's Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic. And they're very much operated differently. And the Arabic channel, well, I don't speak Arabic, and I don't understand a lot of it, but the Arabic channel and the Arabic culture is to be more opinionated. Then the English channel is more of the U.S. or London style journalism in which there is an attempt at objectivity. And one knows there is no such thing, I think, as objectivity. But the Arab channel is much more, they're much more willing to go on the air and say what they think about the politics of the world or the politics of Egypt or whatever it is. And but both are very, very professional. The men and women who work there are trained, and at both sides. In the Arabic channel were former students of ours. On the English channel, former students of ours. And I've had many occasions to be involved with them, and we've brought people from Al Jazeera to Northwestern University in Qatar to talk with the students. They're very willing to help students. So it is, in my opinion, a very positive thing. A better Arabic world news outlet, in my judgment, than Al Arabiya, for instance. So that's my judgment. Okay. Anyone else, please? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've enjoyed it. And thank you all for coming. And as was said earlier, if you haven't been to Qatar, make a point of going there. It's a fabulous place.
There are lots of new projects underway, and not only the stadiums.
Yeah. Okay. What's the best time to visit? The best time to visit is
Winter.
not June, July. Today it was 115 degrees there, okay? July, August, September are really, but the winters there, from November through March, are the most fabulous days of the year. I mean, it's 70, 75 degrees. The sun shines every day of the year. Yeah.
Exactly.
They're going to have perhaps the world's largest, but this giant solar energy fields are being built there because the sun shines every day of the year. So go. Okay, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.